The fire was low when I came over the ridge. I didn't mean to stop. My horse needed water and the creek ran through that canyon, and I'd been riding since before the light got good and I was tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. You know that kind. I was heading nowhere in particular, which is a kind way of saying I was heading away. Away from Refugio. Away from what I'd left there. Away from the man I'd been in the years before I tried to come back, and found out coming back doesn't work the way you think it will when you're far enough gone to miss it. So I was riding, Canyon Creek, water for the horse. That's when I heard it. Not music exactly. A drum, one drum, small, tapped with fingers, not sticks, and beneath it something I can't name to this day. A hum that came and went with the wind. I pulled up on the ridge without deciding to pull up. My horse went still. Animals know when something is happening that isn't for them to interrupt. She was in the clearing below the creek bank, alone. I want to be careful how I say this because I've told it wrong before, told it in the version where I talk about how she looked, and that's not the truth of it. The truth is I didn't know what I was seeing at first. The fire was behind her and the light was dying, and she moved in a way that made the shadows move with her, like they were part of it, part of what she was doing. Her arms went up and then swept low, and her feet found a pattern in the dirt that I couldn't follow, but I could feel it, some rhythm older than anything I'd ever put a name to. Her skirts turned. Her hair was down, which I didn't know until later meant something. I didn't know any of it meant something. I watched. God help me, I watched. Couldn't have been more than 4 or 5 minutes before she stopped. She stopped all at once, not winding down, just stopped, like a fire blown out, stood with her back to me. Then she turned her head and looked straight up at where I was on the ridge. I don't know how she knew. The horse hadn't moved, I hadn't moved. But she looked directly at me from 40 yards in a dying sky like I'd made a sound. I should have ridden on, I know that. Even then I knew it. I touched my hat brim, some fool reflex, and turned my horse and went down the other side of the ridge to find another way to water. 3 days later, they came for me. 5 Apache men. They found me at my camp like they'd known where I was the whole time, which maybe they had. 2 of them I recognized, not by name, but I'd seen them at the trading post in Magdalena, and they'd been civil enough then. Now they were not unfriendly and not friendly either. They were deliberate. There's a difference. Their English was better than my Spanish, and I had enough Spanish to get by, so between the 2 of us we made it work. The one who did the speaking was older, maybe 60, maybe 70, brown and creased, and with eyes so black they looked painted on. He did not waste time. He told me what I'd done. I had watched a woman perform the dance for the dead, a private ritual meant to release the spirit of her husband, who had been killed 8 months before in a raid by men from the north. The dance was done alone, always alone at dusk, facing west, and the law among his people, he said it plain and steady, like a man reading a deed, was that any man who witnessed that dance had claimed her, had by the watching taken the place of the dead husband in the spirit world's accounting. The dance called for a witness, he said. That was part of it. The spirit world sent who it sent. I told him I didn't know. I said it twice. He nodded like a man who'd expected to hear exactly that. He told me what happened to men who witnessed and then refused. I told him I was not a man who refused things out of cowardice. I said it quieter than I meant to, because something had shifted in my chest while he was talking, something I didn't have a word for yet. He looked at me for a long time. Then he asked me my name. I gave it to him. He said something to the others in his own language, and one of them, the youngest, maybe 17, laughed once and then got serious again fast. The older man said, "She was told this morning." I said, "What was she told?" He said that the spirit world had sent her a witness, a white man on a ridge, a man with a gray horse. I didn't say anything for a while. My fire cracked. The older man waited me out, which told me something about him. I said, "Does she want this?" He said, "She wants what the law says." I said, "That's not what I asked." He looked at me again, longer this time. He said, "She does not weep about it." I took that for what it was. Her name was Esada. It meant something in her language that the older man translated as one who remains, which I chewed on for a good while. They brought her to my camp at noon the following day. She rode her own horse, a paint, and she sat it like she'd been born on it, and she looked at me the same way she'd looked up at me from that clearing, direct, measuring, unhurried. She had a blanket roll behind her saddle and a knife on her belt, and a cedar box in her arms that she set down by the fire with both hands, carefully, which told me it held something. The older man was not with them. Just two younger men who said something to her, and she said something back, and then they rode out. We were alone. I said, "I'm sorry for what I saw. I didn't know." She looked at me like she was deciding something. Then she said, in English so clean it startled me, "I know you didn't know. If you had known, the law would be different." I said, "What would the law be then?" She said, "Much worse for you." I almost smiled. She didn't, but her eyes changed a little, and I took that for what it was, too. I poured her coffee. It was bad coffee, trail coffee, thick as mud, and she drank it without a word of complaint, which told me something about her. We didn't talk much that first week. She had her way of being, and I had mine, and we gave each other room. She knew herbs I'd never seen used, and she knew what weather was coming 2 days before it arrived, and she could gut a rabbit faster than any man I'd ridden with. She was not soft, and she was not waiting to be taken care of. She was figuring me out the same way I was figuring her out, careful and quiet, the way you approach a creek crossing when you don't know how deep the bottom goes. I'd lay it out honest. I was a hard man to be around. The years between being young and being the age I was then had done some work on me that didn't sand off easily. I'd made money the wrong way and lost it the right way, and somewhere in the middle of all of that, I'd become somebody I didn't much want to look at. I'd gone back to Refugio thinking I could trade in who I'd been for who I used to be before all of it, and Refugio had made it plain that a town's memory is longer than a man's hope. Esada didn't know any of that, or she didn't know the facts of it, but she watched me the way a woman watches when she's learning a man past what he says, and I had the feeling more than once that she was reading something in me that I couldn't read myself. The fourth night, she asked me what I'd left behind. I told her, a town that didn't want me. She said, "Before that." I said I didn't know what she meant. She said, "Every man who rides alone has left something he couldn't carry. What was yours?" I didn't answer for a while. The fire went low. Out in the dark, something moved through the brush, deer, probably, or a coyote making its rounds. I told her about my boy, how he'd been 7 when I left and would be 14 now, and likely didn't remember me clearly or chose not to, which was about the same thing. How I'd sent money when I had it and not sent anything when I didn't, and how I'd told myself the money meant I was still his father, which was a lie so thin I could see through it. How when I'd gone back to Refugio, I'd walked by the school on a Wednesday and watched the kids come out at noon and tried to pick him out and couldn't, because I didn't know his face anymore. I stopped there. Esada was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You rode away from your son to come here." I said I didn't come here. I was riding away from there. She said, "Same road." I didn't argue with her. She was right, and I was too tired to dress it up otherwise. She said, quiet, "My husband rode toward something too. Men always do. He thought the raid would settle something." She paused. "It settled everything." We sat with that. After a while, she reached across and put her hand flat on the back of mine, not squeezing, just resting there. Her palm was warm and calloused, and she didn't say anything else, and neither did I. That was the night I understood that the spirit world, or whatever you want to call it, might know something a man doesn't. About 3 weeks in, the trouble came. I'd known it was coming. There were men in that part of New Mexico who made their living in ways that required the Apache to not be there, and when word got around that I was camped with an Apache woman, I got looks in town that I recognized from years of practice. Looks that said someone was doing arithmetic. It was 4 men. They came in the early evening, which is a coward's hour, not night, so they could claim they weren't hiding, but the light was going and that suited them. They were the kind of men who decided they were entitled to a thing without examining where that sense of entitlement came from. I knew the type because I'd been around it, and if I'm being square, I'd ridden with some of its cousins once. Esada heard them coming before I did. She was by the fire and she stood up and she looked north and said, 4 horses. I stood up and checked my iron out of habit. Old habit. The kind that doesn't leave no matter how hard you try to put yourself past it. They pulled up at the edge of camp, and the one who'd appointed himself the voice of the group started talking before he'd even stopped his horse. Something about this not being land I had a right to camp on, which was its own kind of joke in that territory. Then he said something about Esada that I will not repeat. I want to tell you I said something steady and righteous. I didn't say anything. I walked to the one who'd been talking, and he was still talking when I reached up and pulled him off his horse by his collar. And everything that happened after that happened fast and isn't worth telling in detail, except to say that when it was over, all 4 of them were in the dirt or heading for the tree line, and I had a split above my eye from a rifle butt, and my ribs on the right side were speaking to me in a way I didn't appreciate. When it was done and it was quiet again, I turned around. Esada was standing where she'd stood the whole time. She had her knife out. She'd had it out before I'd moved, I realized, but she hadn't needed it. She was looking at me with an expression I didn't have a name for. Not fear. Not gratitude, the way women in stories look after a thing like that, wide-eyed and breathy. Something else. Something more like recognition. Like I was someone she'd been waiting to confirm. She came over to me and she put her hand on my face, very carefully, just below the cut above my eye. Her thumb pressed there, not hard, just there, feeling what the damage was. She said, "You didn't even speak first." I said, "Speaking first didn't seem like it would help." She said, "No, it wouldn't have." She went and got the cedar box. Inside it was cloth and dried plants, whose names she told me and I forgot. And she cleaned the cut and packed it with something that smelled like pine and something else I couldn't place. And she wrapped my ribs with strips of cloth that she soaked first in water and some other thing from a small bottle. While she worked, she didn't look at my face. She looked at what she was doing. She said, "My husband was a man who spoke first. He believed if he explained himself clearly enough, men would understand." I said, "I'm sorry." She said, "Don't be. He was braver than he was careful." She paused, pressing the cloth against my side, watching for my reaction to the pressure. Then she said, "You are careful." I said, "I've been called a lot of things. Careful's a new one." She said, "I mean you are careful with things that matter to you." She looked up at me then. "I saw that you didn't move until you were certain." I didn't know what to say to that. I'm not sure there was anything to say. She finished wrapping my ribs and she sat back and she looked at me the way she'd looked up at me on the ridge that first evening, that measuring, unhurried look, and then she said something in her language. I said, "What does that mean?" She said, "It means I am glad the spirit world has long sight." We broke camp 2 days later. Her people had a winter place 2 days' ride south, in the foothills where the timber thickened and the cold came gentler than out on the flats. She'd been planning to go before I'd stumbled onto that ridge. We rode together on the second day. She rode slightly ahead of me most of the morning. Her paint was faster than my gray and she knew the land, but by afternoon, when the ground changed and I didn't, she dropped back beside me and we rode abreast. At one point she said, "You could write to your son." I said, "I don't know what I'd say." She said, "Tell him you are alive. That's enough to start with." I thought about that for a while. The land opened out ahead of us, wide flats before the foothills, the kind of country that makes you feel small in a way that's not bad, small and part of something that doesn't need you to explain yourself to it. I said, "You think he'd want to hear it?" She said, "Every child wants to know their father is alive." I said, "He might not remember me well enough to care." She said, without looking at me, "He remembers. Children always remember, they just get careful about it." The way she said it, she wasn't guessing. She knew something from wherever she kept the things she knew, and I believed her. The winter camp was in a valley between two ridgelines, and her people were already there when we rode in 20, maybe 25, a mix of old and young, and among them the older man who'd come to my fire and read me the law. He watched us ride in. He watched me the way he'd watched me at my camp, direct and without performance, and when I pulled up near the fire circle he walked over and stood looking up at me. He said something in his language. Esada translated. He says, "You have brought her home in one piece." I said, "She didn't need my help with that." Esada translated and the older man listened, and then he said something else. She said, "He says that is true, but you brought her anyway." He reached up and put his hand briefly on my knee. Not a ceremony, just a man's hand on a man's knee for a second. Then he turned and walked back to the fire. I sat on my grave for a moment after that. The evening was coming down cold and clean, and the smell of the fires was cedar and sage, and the sounds of the camp, children, horses, a woman singing something low, came through it all like something had turned up again from far away. Esada had already dismounted. She stood at my horse's head with the paint's reins in her hand, looking up at me, patient the way she was patient, not asking, just waiting. I got down. She took the gray's reins and looped them with the paints and led both horses toward the picket line, and I walked beside her, and after a minute she shifted the reins to one hand and her other hand found mine at my side. She didn't look at me when she did it, just found my hand and held it. Her hand was warm like I remembered from the fire at camp that night weeks back, calloused, sure of itself. I thought about a boy in Refugio who was 14 now and didn't know where I was. I thought about what one who remains meant, in a language I was just starting to learn the edges of. I thought about a ridge at dusk and a fire going low, and the way the shadows had moved with her like they were part of it. The spirit world sends who it sends. Maybe that's right. Maybe it just means that the things that find you for a reason, and only a fool keeps riding away from reasons. The cedar smoke moved across the valley, and the first star came up sharp over the east ridgeline, and she was still holding my hand when we reached the horses, and I stood there, in the cold and the dark coming on, feeling, for the first time in a long time, like a man who had landed somewhere. Not perfect, not solved, just landed. Like I was supposed to be, exactly where I was.